50 stories above the street, on a steel beam no wider than a man's boot, they worked with nothing tethering them to anything. No harness, no rope, nothing between them and the pavement but air. And here's what makes it stranger. Lifelines existed. The technology was there. These men knew a fall would kill them, and they still refused to clip on. The industry's own grim arithmetic accepted roughly one worker's death for every $1 million spent on construction. The easy answer is recklessness, bravado, a death wish. But the real answer, buried in the engineering, the culture, and the brutal mathematics of early safety gear, is far more unsettling than simple courage. In the early 1900s, city dwellers looked up and saw men walking unprotected along steel beams high above the streets. Newspaper columns tried to make sense of it. The New York Times, in 1904, described ironworkers striding across girders with no more apparent concern than if they were walking a country road. To outsiders, it looked like madness. But for those on the job, the reasons ran deeper than bravado. Mobility came first. Early safety lines were heavy, rigid, and often more hindrance than help. A rope could snag on a jagged edge or catch beneath a rivet, turning a quick step into a dangerous tangle. The work demanded constant movement, reaching, pivoting, shifting in sync with the crew and the ever-changing skeleton of steel. Anything that slowed a worker down or forced him to stop and reattach his line became its own risk. On a structure that changed shape by the hour, a lifeline could feel more like a leash. Skill and trust formed the second layer. Many ironworkers came from families who had walked steel for generations. They relied on balance, muscle memory, and teamwork. The Mohawk crews, especially, were known for their sure-footedness. Oral histories recall fathers teaching sons to read the steel by feel, not by faith in a rope. Survival depended on sharp reflexes and unbroken focus, not on hardware that might fail when it mattered most. Culture and pride finished the logic. Among ironworkers, especially within the Mohawk community, refusing the lifeline signaled competence and belonging. Clipping on could be seen as doubting one's own ability. Stories passed down in union halls and family kitchens drew the line between courage and caution as much by tradition as by risk. With crude safety gear, the choice not to tether was a calculation shaped by tools, culture, and the realities of the job. Accidents and deaths were constant reminders that every skyline came at a human price. Steel changed everything. Before the turn of the 20th century, most city buildings stood no higher than a church steeple, their brick and stone walls carrying all the weight they could bear. But in 1902, the Flatiron Building rose above Manhattan's grid. A 22-story wedge of steel and glass that seemed to defy the old rules. Its skeleton, a lattice of riveted beams, let architects reach for the sky without the crushing mass of masonry. 11 years later, the Woolworth Building climbed even higher, topping out at 792 feet and 55 stories. For the first time, engineers could design buildings that soared above the clouds, limited less by gravity than by ambition and money. Steel frames brought speed as well as height. Crews could bolt and rivet beams together in midair, building a new floor every few days. The city's skyline grew by the week, each project demanding more workers willing to balance on narrow girders, exposed to the wind and the city's distant roar below. The work was relentless. Riveters, catchers, and buckers-up formed teams that moved in a practiced rhythm, each man counting on the others to keep pace and keep safe. But the higher the beams climbed, the more the job demanded something different, a kind of nerve and agility that couldn't be taught in a classroom or guaranteed by a safety device. The old trades faded as the steel skeleton took over. Carpenters and masons gave way to men known as steel eaters, men who could walk a 6-inch beam with a sack of bolts on their shoulder. The work was dangerous by every measure, but the city's hunger for height never slowed. Each new record, like the Flatiron's sharp prow, or the Woolworth's Gothic crown, stood as a challenge, not just to architects and engineers, but to the men who would risk their lives to build them. The era of the skyscraper had begun, and with it, a new breed of laborer stepped onto the beams. The story of the ironworkers, especially the Mohawk crews, begins on the banks of the St. Lawrence River in the 1880s. When the Dominion Bridge Company set out to build a cantilever bridge across Mohawk Reserve land, they hired men from the Kanawake community. These first jobs, high above the water, seeded a tradition that would ripple out for generations. By the early 1900s, Mohawk families were making the journey south each year, joining the swelling ranks of New York's steelworkers. Names like Deere, Rice, Mitchell, Lazore, and Jacobs became familiar on city payrolls and in union halls. Oral histories and old photographs capture the Jacobs family in particular. J. Jacobs balanced on a beam at Park Avenue and 53rd, a steel silhouette against the city's rising skyline. For these families, ironwork was more than a job. It was a rite of passage, a thread tying fathers, sons, and brothers to a shared purpose. The work demanded more than strength. It required nerve, balance, and the ability to read the steel's subtle shifts. Stories passed down at kitchen tables and union meetings told of men who could sense a beam's vibration or judge the wind by the way it whistled through the lattice. Language, too, played a part. On the beams, Kanyenkeha echoed between workers, reinforcing a sense of belonging that set Mohawk crews apart from others on the skyline. The International Association of Bridge and Structural Iron Workers, founded in 1896, became both a shield and a proving ground. While union rules shaped pay and hours, the deeper code was unwritten: loyalty to the crew, pride in the work, and the belief that skill and composure defined a true iron worker. The Mohawk presence on the steel was so constant that contractors would seek out their crews for the hardest, highest jobs. Their reputation for calm at dizzying heights was not just legend, but a living reality, forged beam by beam across decades. Today, oral history projects and museum collections work to preserve these stories, recognizing that the skyscraper's bones are as much Mohawk as Manhattan. Each name in the record stands for a life spent in the wind, a family shaped by risk, and a community that built the city's skyline from the inside out. If you have a story or memory of these iron workers, share it in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the hidden corners of history. Wind claws at the steel, 30 stories above the city. The only thing beneath a boot is a 12-inch wide beam, slick with morning dew or dust from the rivet guns. The air moves fast, gusts reach 30 miles an hour, enough to rattle a lunch pail or steal a cap right off a man's head. Each step is a calculation. A riveter's world shrinks to a narrow strip of iron, sometimes just a foot across, with nothing but empty space on either side. The pace is relentless. Hot rivets fly through the air, tossed from heater to catcher in a practiced arc. A team might drive 60 rivets a minute, hammers ringing out a rhythm that drowns out the city far below. Every man knows his part. The bucker braces for the impact. The catcher snags a glowing rivet bare-handed with a thick leather glove. The riveter slams it home before the metal cools. There's no time to hesitate, no room for error. Behind them, the skeleton of the building grows. Another floor, another beam, another day spent in the wind. The equipment is basic. A canvas bag holds bolts and tools slung over a shoulder or dragged along the beam. There's no safety net, no harness, just the steel, the sky, and a rope that's more burden than protection. Early lifelines are heavy and stiff, prone to snagging on the rough edges of a beam or catching under a rivet. A rope can pull a man off balance or trap a foot at the worst moment. Moving fast, reaching for a rivet, ducking a beam swung by a crane, means freedom matters more than any promise of safety. Every ironworker weighs the risk. A lifeline might save a life, but it could just as easily cost one if it tangles at the wrong time. Lifelines. Trust is everything. The men rely on their balance, on the memory of 100 careful steps, on the instinct that tells them when the wind is about to shift. There's a constant awareness of where the next handhold is, where the nearest teammate stands. A glance, a word in Kanyankea, a nod. Communication is spare but precise. Mistakes are rare, but when they happen, the consequences are immediate and final. Trust. For the everyman riveter, the day is a test of nerve and muscle memory. The city's noise fades to a dull hum. What matters is the clatter of steel, the feel of the beam underfoot, the next hot rivet coming down the line. The logic behind refusing a lifeline is not bravado, but a hard-edged calculation. On these beams, hesitating can be just as deadly as falling. Logic accidents are part of the work. Everyone knows someone who didn't make it home. Yet the skyline keeps rising, each building a monument to the men who risked everything for a paycheck and a sense of pride. The cost is measured in names lost to time, names that once echoed in the wind above the city. Skyline. These are the lives behind the glass and steel, the hands that built the skyline. If you have a story or memory of these workers, share it below. Subscribe for more untold stories from the heights of history. Early lifelines were supposed to offer a measure of safety, but their design often turned them into a hazard of their own. The first commercial models, like the Bullard-Gerber patent from the 1890s, combined a steel wire core with a canvas sheath. On paper, this hybrid promised both strength and durability. In practice, the rope was stiff, heavy, and awkward. A quarter-inch steel core might withstand a braking load of 10 kilonewtons, about 2,200 pounds, but the real-world working limit was set much lower, often around 3 kilonewtons or roughly 670 pounds. That margin left little room for error if a man slipped and the full force of a fall snapped through the line. The problem ran deeper than numbers. These ropes stretched under sudden strain, first as the wires compressed together, then as the steel itself gave way. Even a short fall could generate a shock load several times a man's weight, overwhelming the rope's capacity. Accident reports from 1904 detail a fatality where a lifeline snapped as a worker descended a steel column. The coroner cited both corrosion at the anchor and the sudden jolt of the fall. Without modern energy-absorbing lanyards, all the force traveled straight through the worker's body or the rope's weakest point. Anchorage was another weak link. Most lifelines were tied off to whatever was handy, a beam flange, a column, or a makeshift eye bolt hammered out on site. Proper terminations, which require a minimum bend radius to avoid stress fractures, were rarely achieved. Instead, hand-forged eyes and carriage clamps introduced cracks that could spread invisibly until the rope failed. Inspections were informal at best, and few contractors bothered with proof loading. Modern standards call for a safety factor of 5 times the working load. Early lifelines might be tested to twice their rated limit, if at all. Corrosion and abrasion made things worse. Steel wires rusted in the rain, and the canvas sheath wore thin against the sharp edges of the beams. Over time, the actual strength of a lifeline could drop far below its original rating, especially in the harsh environment of an open job site. There was no redundancy. If a single line failed, there was no backup. The idea of a dual line tether, now standard, wouldn't appear until the 1920s, after a string of high-profile deaths forced the issue. In this context, the logic of refusing a lifeline becomes clearer. The gear was not just uncomfortable or cumbersome, it was unreliable in ways that could prove fatal. For many ironworkers, the choice was not between safety and bravado, but between two different risks. When the tools designed to save lives could not be trusted, the decision to rely on skill and teamwork was not simply a matter of pride. It was a grim calculation, shaped by the limits of the technology and the realities of the job. The Skyline's rise was built on these daily acts of judgment, each one balancing imperfect tools against the constant threat of a fall. A lifeline was supposed to be a worker's last defense, but on the steel it often became a problem of its own. The early ropes and tethers, built from a heavy manila or stiff steel wire, dragged behind a man's boots, catching on rivets or the sharp edge of a flange. Every step demanded attention, not just to balance, but to the rope's path, which could snag or tighten at the worst moment. A riveter moving with his crew might have to stop and unhook, reattach, or even double back to free a tangled line, turning a routine walk into a slow-motion obstacle course. On a structure that changed by the hour, the geometry of beams and columns never stayed the same. A man might be forced to anchor his line to a point 10 feet behind him, limiting his reach and making every move a negotiation with slack and tension. If a teammate needed help, catching a rivet, steadying a swinging beam, seconds counted. A lifeline could cost precious time. Studies from later decades measured a 12-second delay just to unclip and reattach a line for a single step around a column. In the rhythm of a riveting gang, where 60 rivets might be set in a minute, even that brief pause could break the flow and put the whole crew at risk. Then there was the danger of the line itself. A rope stretched tight could snap back under a sudden load, whipping with enough force to break a wrist or knock a man off balance. If a worker fell, the jolt could pull another man down with him or swing the body into the beams with bone-breaking force. Accident reports from the early 1900s describe more than one fatality where a lifeline, meant to save, became the instrument of injury. The gear was unforgiving, and every man on the steel knew it. Mobility was not a luxury, it was survival. The ability to move fast, adjust to shifting beams, and respond to danger in real time mattered more than any promise a rope could make. For these men, the steel demanded constant motion and absolute focus. Anything that interfered with that, no matter how well-intentioned, was weighed as a risk of its own. Balance on the steel was not a matter of luck. For the men who built the city's tallest frames, survival meant reading the wind, feeling the tremor of a beam, and trusting the body's own reflexes. A seasoned ironworker could sense the difference between a girder that was bolted tight and one that rocked underfoot. Decades of practice taught them to adjust their footing in less than a heartbeat. Oral histories say it took just 0.2 of a second to recover from a slip, a margin too narrow for any rope or harness to help. One ironworker put it plainly, "We have as much fear as the next guy. The difference is that we deal with it better." That line, quoted in the Smithsonian's Booming Out exhibit, captures the quiet confidence that ran through the trade. These men didn't see themselves as fearless. They felt the fear, weighed it, and stepped forward anyway. The trust they placed in their own skill and in the instincts honed by years on the beams was not bravado. It was a tool, as real as a spud wrench or a rivet gun. On the job, there was no time for second-guessing. The rhythm of the crew depended on each man's ability to move with certainty. If a rivet heater hesitated or a catcher lost his nerve, the whole line could falter. The margin for error was razor thin. In that world, the idea of pausing to clip and unclip a lifeline seemed almost absurd. Every step was a calculation, every shift of weight a test of judgment. Fathers taught sons to read the steel by watching the sway of a beam or the way dust danced in a gust of wind. Stories passed down in family kitchens told of near misses and narrow escapes, but also of the pride that came with mastering the work. Skill was more than a point of pride. It was the difference between going home at the end of the day or not. For the everyman riveter, trust in one's own ability was not optional. It was the only guarantee the job allowed. Skill, balance, and instinct became the lifeline these workers counted on. The city's skyline may have risen on steel, but it was built on the quiet confidence of men who trusted their own hands more than any rope. Share your thoughts below. and subscribe for more untold stories from the heights of history. Speed shaped the ironworkers' world. Among union crews, moving fast wasn't just about finishing the job, it was proof you belonged. 60 rivets a minute, every man in sync, became the standard. A pause to clip in, even for safety, could draw a silent rebuke. Reputation hung on keeping pace. The fastest earned the hardest jobs and the best pay. Hesitation risked being seen as weak or out of step. And in this culture, that mattered as much as skill. For Mohawk ironworkers, pride carried a different weight. The trip from Kanawake or Akwesasne to the city was more than a commute. It was a passage repeated across generations. Young men learned the trade at home, surrounded by fathers and uncles who had built towers and bridges before them. Joining a high steel crew was a rite of passage, marking the shift from boyhood to manhood. Stories passed down at kitchen tables and union halls spoke of ancestors who had walked the steel, relying on balance, nerve, and trust in their own hands. The Smithsonian's Booming Out exhibit preserves the words of one Mohawk ironworker. "We have as much fear as the next guy. The difference is that we deal with it better." That quiet confidence ran through every crew. Refusing a lifeline wasn't bravado, it was a way to honor training and family. On the beams, Kenyankea, the Mohawk language, echoed between workers, reinforcing bonds that stretched beyond the job. Speaking their language high above the city became a way to claim space and remind each other that the work was about heritage as much as earning a living. Union culture added its own pressure. The mantra was simple: keep moving, don't let the crew down. Pride in skill was matched by pride in speed. The best ironworkers made it look effortless, finishing a floor before sunset. A lifeline, however well-intended, could feel like a mark of doubt, a sign you didn't trust yourself or your brothers. Every man understood the risk, and every family carried the weight of loss. Yet the stories that survived of courage, balance, and belonging became part of the skyline. The refusal to clip on was shaped by pride as much as practicality, a logic forged in steel and memory. Early skyscraper engineers confronted a problem that numbers alone made clear. The safety factor, the margin between a rope's rated strength and the force it might actually face, was set at 2, sometimes 3. Today's standard is 5. In practice, a lifeline rated for 2,200 pounds would be trusted with only 670 pounds on the job. Any sudden fall could multiply a worker's weight, pushing the rope to its limit in an instant. The equipment itself posed its own threat. Lifelines with steel wire cores wrapped in canvas weighed up to 20 pounds and resisted movement. Dragging such a line across beams risked snagging or whipping, especially when tension spiked. If a worker slipped, the rope might catch on a sharp edge or rusted rivet, channeling the entire shock to a single corroded anchor. In 1904, a lifeline snapped as a man descended a column. Corrosion and the violent force of the fall combined to defeat the cable. There was no energy-absorbing lanyard, no backup. The whole system relied on a single, often improvised connection point. Proof loading, the process of testing a rope to confirm its strength, was rare. Most lifelines were never subjected to more than twice their rated load before use, if they were tested at all. Modern protocols demand 5 times the working load, with every anchor and termination inspected. But on busy sites, time and cost ruled. Workers and foremen trusted what they had, relying on experience instead of the uncertain promise of new gear. For ironworkers, the logic was unforgiving. A lifeline that might fail was worse than none at all. The refusal to clip on was not bravado, but a calculation based on evidence. If the equipment could not be trusted under real conditions, skill and teamwork offered better odds. Each decision high above the city was a measured response to flawed technology. The city's skyline rose on these choices, shaped by risk and the hard arithmetic of survival. The human cost of building the skyline was measured not just in stories climbed, but in lives lost. On the ledgers of the early 1900s, the numbers are stark. In 1915 alone, over 1,000 construction workers died on the job across the United States. In New York City, the annual death rate for ironworkers hovered between 150 and 200 for every 100,000 employed, a figure 5 times higher than the average for manufacturing. Each fatality was more than a statistic. Names filled the union registers and city coroners' ledgers. John McKenna, lost when a scaffold collapsed on the Woolworth building. James Harris, who fell from the 86th floor of the Empire State Site. Newspapers gave brief notice, a paragraph or two for a man who had vanished into the city's upward rush. The industry carried its own grim wisdom: 1 death for every $1 million spent. This was not just a slogan, but a quiet calculation passed between foremen and crews. The risk was accepted as part of the trade. Families braced for the knock at the door. Wives and children mourned in the shadow of towers their loved ones would never see finished. Among Mohawk ironworkers, the loss rippled through entire communities, each name remembered in stories and ceremonies that stretched far beyond the city limits. Pain and memory settled over the job sites. For every man who survived a close call, another was carried down in silence. The price of speed, skill, and pride was paid in funerals and empty chairs at the table. Yet the work continued. The city's hunger for height did not pause for grief. The names of the dead faded from the headlines, but their absence lingered in the rhythm of the crews and the stories told at home. The skyline that millions admire today stands on the sacrifices of those who climbed without guarantees. Their choices, shaped by flawed equipment, hard lessons, and an unspoken code, left a legacy written in both steel and sorrow. If you have a story or a thought to share, leave it below. Subscribe for more histories that reveal the people behind the city's greatest heights. By the early 1900s, the dangers of working high above the city had become impossible to ignore. Inspectors and engineers began searching for solutions that could make the job less deadly without sacrificing the speed and skill that defined ironwork. In 1907, the Gerber safety net appeared, a web of rope and canvas designed to catch falling workers, anchored to beams with hooks meant to withstand over 5,000 pounds. It was an improvement, but still a temporary fix, mostly used in elevator shafts or open bays where the risk was greatest. The first real code, published in 1919, set rules for anchoring safety lines, requiring that any point used to tie off must be strong enough to hold 5 times the expected load. This 5-to-1 safety factor became a new benchmark, though on many sites it remained more theory than practice. Change came slowly. Early standards were patchwork, enforced by a handful of inspectors who walked the beams with the crews, checking knots and measuring anchors with cold precision. Each new rule or device was met with skepticism, especially from men who had learned to trust their own judgment above all else. Still, the seeds of regulation had been planted. Over the decades, these early codes grew into the complex safety standards seen today, culminating in OSHA's Subpart M, which now governs every lifeline, net, and harness on a modern site. The transformation was not just about technology, but about shifting the balance between risk and protection, between tradition and the promise of a safer future. In 2022, the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian opened its Booming Out exhibit, placing the names and faces of Mohawk ironworkers at the center of the story. For the first time, the public could read the credit line, "On loan from the grandchildren of the men who built the skyline." The display included hard hats, photographs, and a single quote that echoed through the hall: "We have as much fear as the next guy. The difference is that we deal with it better." For families whose ancestors walked the beams, pride and loss are inseparable. Grandchildren point to old photographs and see more than daring. They see a legacy of skill, sacrifice, and community. Oral histories collected from Kanawake and Akwesasne tell of fathers and uncles who left home each spring, returning with stories and paychecks that kept the family afloat. The work shaped not only the skyline, but the lives of those who built it and those who came after. Every steel beam, every rivet, carries the memory of men who measured fear against necessity and chose to keep moving. Their courage and fatalism are written into the city's bones, a legacy that endures in the stories families tell. Share your own memories or thoughts below, and subscribe for more untold histories from the heights of the past. High above a city waking to steel and sky, early ironworkers weighed every step, mobility, pride, survival, against the world's crude safety lines. Today, modern harnesses save lives, yet the skyline still rests on choices made beam by beam at breathtaking risk. The cost of progress is written in every rivet, every name lost to history. Before you look up, remember those who never clipped in. Share your thoughts below. For more stories like this, subscribe.